The small courtroom was packed with people. Some were nervously shifting in their seats. Others whispered quietly as they waited for their cases to be called. Judge Thomas Wilkins, a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair and a no-nonsense attitude, entered the courtroom. His stern gaze swept over the room as he took his seat. Everyone fell silent. Judge Wilkins was known for being strict and efficient. He didn't like to waste time, and he didn't hide his impatience when someone made excuses. To him, the courtroom was a place for rules, not for second chances. It was a rainy morning, and Alicia Bennett, a confident black woman in her mid-30s, walked into the courtroom. She wore a professional navy blue suit and carried a small folder in her hand. Her posture was straight, and her expression calm. Still, there was something about her presence that made a few people glance up. She didn't look like the usual defendants they saw in the room. Alicia had been called to court for a minor parking violation. A ticket had been issued because her car was parked in a no-parking zone. She believed the ticket was unfair since the sign had been unclear, but the system required her to attend a hearing to explain herself. Alicia didn't seem worried. She sat quietly, waiting for her name to be called. When the clerk announced Alicia Bennett, she stood and walked confidently to the front of the room. Judge Wilkins barely looked up from his papers as she approached. "Miss Bennett, you are here for a parking violation," the judge said, his voice flat and dismissive. "The ticket states your vehicle was parked in a restricted area." Alicia nodded politely. "Yes, Your Honor. However, I would like to explain the circumstances. The sign near the parking area was damaged and difficult to read. I wasn't aware it was a no-parking zone." The judge raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem interested in her explanation. "The sign being damaged doesn't change the law. You should have been more careful," he replied sharply. Alicia remained calm, though a faint flicker of frustration crossed her face. "Your Honor, I believe there's room for reasonable judgment in this matter." Judge Wilkins cut her off. "Miss Bennett, this is a simple case. The law is the law. The fine is $100, payable immediately or through the court's payment system. Do you have anything else to add?" For a moment, Alicia looked like she might say something, but instead, she shook her head and replied, "No, Your Honor." The judge banged his gavel. "Next case." As Alicia walked out of the courtroom, a few people whispered among themselves. There was something about her calm confidence that didn't fit the judge's dismissive treatment. One young lawyer sitting in the back seemed to recognize her and raised an eyebrow. He leaned over to the person next to him and whispered, "Isn't that?" But before he could finish, Alicia had already disappeared through the courtroom doors, leaving an air of mystery behind her. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs after Alicia left, but Judge Wilkins remained as rigid and uninterested as ever. To him, it was just another case, just another fine. He had presided over countless hearings, and they all felt the same to him. He didn't give much thought to the people who stood before him. They were just names on a docket. However, for some reason, Alicia Bennett lingered in his mind. There was something about her tone and the way she carried herself that felt different. But Judge Wilkins brushed it aside, thinking, probably just another defendant with a polished excuse. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, Alicia walked down the courthouse steps. Her calm expression never wavered, though she felt a flicker of frustration. She had encountered dismissive attitudes before, but this felt particularly pointed. Still, she reminded herself that composure was her strength. She wasn't about to let the judge's attitude rattle her. As she headed toward her car, a young lawyer rushed out behind her. "Excuse me," he called, jogging to catch up. Alicia stopped and turned to face him. "Yes," she asked politely. "I couldn't help but notice. Are you Alicia Bennett?" the man asked, adjusting his tie nervously. Alicia raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I am. Do we know each other?" The lawyer smiled awkwardly. "Not directly, but I've read about you. You're the new district attorney, right?" Alicia offered a small, knowing smile. "That's correct. But let's keep that between us for now." The lawyer's eyes widened. "Wow, I can't believe Judge Wilkins didn't recognize you in there. The way he talked to you." He stopped himself, realizing he was about to say something disrespectful about the judge. Alicia's smile faded slightly. "I noticed," she said simply. "But it's not the first time, and it won't be the last. The important thing is to focus on the work that really matters." The lawyer nodded, impressed by her poise. "Well, I'm sorry you had to deal with that. If there's anything I can do—" "Thank you, but I'll handle it," Alicia said, her voice firm yet kind. Sometimes people need a little reminder about fairness, and sometimes those reminders come naturally. As she walked away, the young lawyer watched her with a newfound respect. He couldn't help but wonder how the judge would react when he eventually realized who Alicia Bennett really was. Back in the courthouse, Judge Wilkins wrapped up his cases for the day. As he reviewed his schedule for the following week, a name caught his eye: Alicia Bennett. His brow furrowed. He knew he'd just dealt with someone by that name, but why did it seem so familiar? He tried to recall where else he might have heard it, but nothing came to mind. Later that evening, Judge Wilkins sat in his study with a cup of tea. He opened the local newspaper to unwind, and there it was, a front-page article about the newly appointed district attorney, Alicia Bennett. Her photo stared back at him, her sharp eyes and calm smile instantly recognizable. The judge's heart skipped a beat. "No," he whispered to himself, leaning closer to the paper. "It can't be." But it was. The realization sent a chill down his spine. The woman he had dismissed so quickly in court wasn't just any defendant. She was the district attorney. The next morning, Judge Wilkins found himself unusually distracted. The morning light streamed through his office windows, but his mind kept drifting back to yesterday's hearing. He kept replaying Alicia Bennett's calm, confident demeanor in his head, but now everything felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling of embarrassment. He had fined her like any other defendant without even considering who she was. And now he realized that he had treated the district attorney with an attitude he would never have dared to show someone else. As the hours passed, his unease grew. He tried to push it away, focusing on the cases in front of him, but Alicia's face kept appearing in his mind. He wanted to forget it, but he couldn't. The guilt gnawed at him. What if she decides to bring it up? What if someone finds out how I treated her? Meanwhile, in the courthouse hallways, whispers about the previous day's court session began to spread. Some of the staff had overheard the conversation in the hallway between Alicia and the young lawyer. The word that the woman who had been fined was actually the new district attorney was spreading like wildfire. "I didn't realize it was her," a clerk told a colleague in the break room. "She's the new DA, but she looked so calm and unbothered, like she wasn't bothered by the fine at all." "Yeah, I heard she's the one who's going to clean up this town's justice system," the other clerk replied, clearly impressed. "I don't think Judge Wilkins knew who he was dealing with. Not a good move on his part." The rumor continued to spread across the courthouse like wildfire, and by midday, several lawyers who had attended the session the day before were talking about it. Some of them were surprised that Judge Wilkins had acted so dismissively, given that Alicia was well known in legal circles. One young lawyer, a man named Marcus, overheard a conversation in the hallway while waiting for his case to be called. Two older attorneys were gossiping about the incident. "I heard she's already making waves," one lawyer said. "No one saw it coming. A woman of color, and she's already shaking things up as DA. If I were Wilkins, I'd be worried." Marcus couldn't help but smile. He had been quietly watching Alicia throughout the proceedings the day before. She was calm and collected, a stark contrast to the judge's impatient attitude. He had sensed that she wasn't an ordinary defendant, and now it all made sense. He stepped forward to introduce himself to the group. "Did you guys know that she's not just the district attorney, but also the most respected lawyer in the region?" he said, a bit louder than he intended. "If I were Wilkins, I'd be taking notes." One of the older attorneys raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" he asked, curious. "I mean," Marcus replied with a grin, I think the judge might have just made a mistake. He clearly didn't recognize her. And now, with everything that's been happening in the court lately, well, let's just say it's not a good look for him. The hallway fell silent for a moment as the words sank in. Slowly, they all nodded, realizing how big of a mistake it had been for Judge Wilkins to treat Alicia Bennett with such disrespect. Back in his office, Judge Wilkins sat at his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he read over his papers. The weight of his actions was beginning to sink in. He hadn't just fined a defendant. Had disrespected someone who could now potentially change the direction of the entire legal system in their town. He groaned, realizing the damage had already been done. The whispers were already starting. How would he face her when their paths crossed again? The day after the court hearing, Judge Wilkins couldn't stop thinking about Alicia Bennett. His mind kept circling back to her calm expression as she left the courtroom, to the way she had handled his rude behavior without showing the slightest bit of anger. But now, with the realization that she was the district attorney, everything felt different. He knew he had to make things right, but the question was, how? The judge decided to look up more about Alicia Bennett. It didn't take long for him to find her name in the local news. There were articles about her recent appointment as district attorney and her strong stance on fairness in the courtroom. As he read, he felt his stomach twist. Alicia wasn't just a lawyer. She was already making waves in the legal community, challenging old practices and advocating for justice. Judge Wilkins leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. He knew he had made a serious mistake. He had dismissed her in a way he would never have done to other people, especially someone with the kind of influence and respect Alicia had. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about respect, and he had failed to show her any. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his office, the phone rang. It was a call from the courthouse. The voice on the other end was calm, but the message was clear. Judge Wilkins, there's a seminar tomorrow morning. District Attorney Alicia Bennett is the guest speaker. It's about judicial fairness and bias in the legal system. Would you like to attend? The judge hesitated. He knew this was the perfect chance to see Alicia again, to apologize, to make things right. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the discomfort he felt. What would she think of him after everything that had happened? Was it too late to fix it? After a moment of contemplation, he decided to go. It's the right thing to do, he thought. I'll find a way to make it right. The next morning, the seminar hall was packed. Judges, lawyers, and legal professionals filled the seats, all eager to hear Alicia Bennett speak. The room buzzed with conversation, but when Alicia walked in, a hush fell over the crowd. She was poised and professional, wearing a dark blue suit that made her stand out. Her presence commanded respect without saying a word. Judge Wilkins sat at the back, his heart racing as he saw her. He felt a mix of admiration and shame. He could barely focus on her introduction, knowing that his previous actions were now weighing heavily on his conscience. Alicia began speaking, her voice clear and confident. Our legal system is built on fairness, on justice, on equality. But we know that, too often, bias slips into the system, whether we're aware of it or not. That bias affects decisions, outcomes, and lives. Her words hit Judge Wilkins harder than he expected. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was the fact that they were coming from someone he had just dismissed as an ordinary defendant. Alicia didn't just stand for justice. She was an example of it. She had earned every ounce of respect she had, and Judge Wilkins had failed to give it to her. As Alicia spoke about fairness and the importance of acknowledging bias, Judge Wilkins felt the weight of his actions more deeply than ever. He wasn't just ashamed. He was determined to change. This seminar, this moment, was his wake-up call. He knew he had to do more than just apologize. He had to prove that he had learned from his mistake. The seminar hall was filled with the sound of applause as Alicia Bennett finished speaking. She had spoken about the importance of fairness in the courtroom, challenging the legal community to recognize and confront their own biases. The room was buzzing with energy, but for Judge Wilkins, it felt like time had slowed down. He sat quietly in the back, still processing everything she had said. The weight of his actions was heavy on his shoulders, but hearing Alicia's words only made him realize how much he had to learn. After the seminar ended, the attendees slowly began to file out, but Judge Wilkins hesitated. He wasn't sure what to do next. He had wanted to meet Alicia before, but now that he knew who she was, he felt even more conflicted. How could he possibly face her after what he had done? But as the last few people left the hall, Alicia spotted him sitting at the back, looking lost in thought. She smiled and walked over to him. There was no anger in her eyes, only a calm understanding. "Judge Wilkins," she said, extending her hand. "It's good to see you here today." He stood up quickly, feeling a little flustered. He had rehearsed his apology in his mind 1,000 times, but now that the moment had come, the words felt heavy on his tongue. "Alicia," he said, his voice steady but full of remorse, "I owe you an apology. I was disrespectful to you in my courtroom yesterday, and I deeply regret it." Alicia nodded, her expression unchanged. "I appreciate your honesty," she said simply, "but you should know that it's not just about the fine. It's about the way you assume things about me because of the way I looked. That kind of bias can seep into everything we do, even if we don't realize it." Judge Wilkins nodded, feeling a sense of guilt rise in his chest. He had never seen it that way before. He had been so quick to judge Alicia, assuming she was just another defendant who didn't deserve his full attention. But now, after hearing her speak, he realized how wrong he had been. "I understand now," he said quietly, "and I'm committed to doing better, to making sure I treat everyone with the respect they deserve, no matter who they are or where they come from." Alicia smiled, and for the first time, Judge Wilkins felt like he was starting to understand what true fairness looked like. "We all have work to do," she said, "but the important thing is that you're willing to learn." After their conversation, Judge Wilkins felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew it wouldn't be easy to change, but hearing Alicia's words gave him hope. He didn't want to be the kind of person who dismissed others based on assumptions. He wanted to be better. As he walked out of the seminar hall, he thought about how Alicia had handled the situation with such grace and wisdom. She hadn't shouted or pointed fingers. She had simply spoken the truth, and for that, he was grateful. The next day, Judge Wilkins returned to his courtroom, but this time, things felt different. He was more aware of his actions, more conscious of the way he interacted with the people who appeared before him. He made a promise to himself that he would treat everyone with the fairness and respect they deserved, no matter their background. As the day went on, he found himself thinking about Alicia Bennett's words more and more. "Sometimes it's the small changes that make the biggest difference," he thought, and he was determined to start making those changes, one step at a time. The next few days felt different for Judge Wilkins. He spent a lot of time reflecting on his actions and thinking about the changes he wanted to make in his courtroom. He had always prided himself on being a firm but fair judge, but Alicia's words had made him realize that there was more to fairness than he had ever considered. It wasn't just about following the law. It was about treating everyone with respect, regardless of who they were or where they came from. A few days after the seminar, Judge Wilkins found himself attending another one of Alicia Bennett's talks, this time held in the local community center. The event was packed with people from all walks of life: attorneys, social workers, local residents, and law enforcement. The room was buzzing with anticipation as Alicia took the stage, her calm demeanor commanding attention. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today," she said, her voice steady and confident. "Tonight, I want to talk about something very important: how we can work together to create a justice system that treats everyone equally. It's not enough to just talk about fairness. We must act on it. We must challenge our own biases and make sure that they don't affect our decisions." Judge Wilkins listened intently, his eyes fixed on Alicia. She spoke with such passion and purpose, her words resonating deeply with him. He couldn't help but feel that she was talking directly to him. There are many people who don't realize how much bias exists in the justice system, Alicia continued. But it's there, in small ways, in big ways, and it affects everyone. From the way we treat defendants to the way we make decisions about their futures, bias can sneak into everything we do, whether we want it to or not. Her words hit Judge Wilkins harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on being impartial, on following the law without letting personal feelings or assumptions influence his decisions. But Alicia's speech made him realize that bias didn't always show up in obvious ways. Sometimes it was in the small, unnoticed actions, the quick judgments, the assumptions, the way people were treated differently based on their appearance. I've seen firsthand how bias can affect people, Alicia said, her voice growing more passionate. As a district attorney, I've seen innocent people lose their cases, not because they were guilty, but because the system didn't give them a fair chance. It's not just about the big cases, it's about every case, every person who walks into a courtroom. Judge Wilkins couldn't help but think back to the day when Alicia had walked into his courtroom. He had judged her too quickly, assuming that she was just another defendant. But now, he understood that fairness meant more than just making a decision based on the law. It meant looking at each person with an open mind and treating them with dignity and respect. I know that change is hard, Alicia said, but it's not impossible. We can all do better. We can all learn to challenge our biases and create a justice system that truly serves everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from. The audience erupted into applause, and Judge Wilkins couldn't help but join in. He felt a sense of gratitude for Alicia's words, for the way she had opened his eyes to a truth he had been blind to for so long. He knew that his journey toward becoming a better judge wasn't going to be easy, but it was one he was determined to take. After the speech, Alicia stayed around to talk to people. She was approachable and kind, listening to their concerns and offering advice where she could. When Judge Wilkins finally had the chance to speak with her, he felt nervous but determined. "Alicia," he said, extending his hand, "I just want to thank you. Your speech today really opened my eyes." Alicia smiled warmly and shook his hand. "I'm glad to hear that, Judge Wilkins. But remember, it's about more than just words. It's about action." Judge Wilkins nodded, a newfound sense of purpose in his chest. "And I'm ready to take that action." The days after Alicia's speech felt like a turning point for Judge Wilkins. He found himself reflecting more on his actions, and he could no longer ignore the lesson Alicia had taught him. He had spent his entire career priding himself on being fair and impartial, but the truth was, he hadn't always been as objective as he thought. He had allowed his assumptions to cloud his judgment. The opportunity to meet with Alicia privately came sooner than he expected. He had been invited to a small legal gathering where Alicia was scheduled to speak again. After her talk, many attendees gathered in small groups, discussing the topics she had raised. Judge Wilkins, who had been quietly observing, found himself standing near her as she finished a conversation with someone else. "Judge Wilkins," Alicia said, noticing him. She smiled warmly. "I'm glad you could make it today." "Of course," he replied, his voice sincere. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've taught me over the last week. Your speeches, they've been eye-opening." Alicia's smile softened. "I'm glad to hear that. It's not always easy to see our own biases, but once we do, it's a lot easier to change." There was a pause before she added, "If you don't mind, could we talk for a few minutes? I'd like to hear your thoughts." Judge Wilkins felt a bit nervous. He had been thinking about this conversation for days, but now that the moment was here, he wasn't sure where to begin. Still, he knew it was important. "Absolutely," he said, leading the way to a quieter corner of the room. Once they sat down, there was a brief silence. Judge Wilkins cleared his throat, then began, "I've been thinking a lot about the way I treated you in court. I wasn't fair, and I didn't give you the respect you deserved." Alicia nodded, her expression kind but serious. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge. It's not easy to admit when we're wrong, but it's a vital step toward growth." "I've spent my whole career thinking that I was doing things by the book," he continued, his voice reflecting the frustration he felt. "I've always prided myself on following the law, on being impartial. But I didn't realize how much my assumptions were clouding my judgment. I didn't see you for who you really are. I saw you as just another defendant, someone I could dismiss without thinking twice." Alicia listened intently. "We all make mistakes, but the key is recognizing them and being willing to change." Judge Wilkins looked at her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "That's the thing. You've made me realize that fairness goes beyond just applying the law. It's about treating every person with respect, regardless of their background. You've taught me that being impartial doesn't mean ignoring who a person is. It means understanding them and treating them equally." Alicia smiled, her eyes softening. "That's a valuable lesson, Judge. I'm glad you're taking the time to learn it." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Judge Wilkins felt as though a burden had been lifted from him. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that he was on the right path. He wasn't the same man he had been when he had first dismissed Alicia in court, and he was ready to prove it. "I want to do better," he said finally. "I want to make sure that everyone who comes into my courtroom is treated with fairness, no matter who they are." Alicia nodded. "That's all anyone can ask for, and I know you'll get there. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with a commitment to be better." As they spoke, Judge Wilkins felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just learning about the law anymore. He was learning about people, about justice in its truest form, and he was grateful to Alicia for showing him the way. "I'll keep working at it," he promised, "and I'll make sure that the people who come into my courtroom know they're being treated fairly." Alicia gave him an encouraging smile. "I believe you will, Judge. You're already on the right path." The following week, Judge Wilkins walked into his courtroom with a new sense of purpose. The familiar sound of the gavel echoed through the room as he took his seat, but this time something felt different. The weight of his previous actions was still in his mind, but now he was determined to make a change. He couldn't afford to forget the lessons Alicia Bennett had taught him, and he wouldn't. As the first case of the day was called, Judge Wilkins looked over at the defendant. It was a young man, no older than 20, who had been charged with theft. Normally, Judge Wilkins might have been quick to sentence him, assuming the young man was guilty based on the charges. But now, with a clear focus on fairness, he took a deep breath and reminded himself to listen, to really listen. The young man spoke nervously, explaining that he had only taken the items because he was struggling to feed his family. He seemed honest, but his words could easily have been dismissed if Judge Wilkins hadn't taken the time to hear him out. "Your Honor," the defendant said, "I know what I did was wrong, but I didn't know where else to turn. My family is hungry. I just wanted to help them." Judge Wilkins sat back in his chair, considering the situation carefully. He didn't rush to judgment. Instead, he looked at the young man, seeing not just the defendant, but a person who was facing difficult circumstances. The same way Alicia had challenged him to look beyond appearances, Judge Wilkins now took a moment to consider the human being standing before him. "I understand," the judge said, his voice calm but firm. "But taking something that doesn't belong to you is not the way to solve your problems. However, I also believe that everyone deserves a chance to make things right." He sentenced the young man to community service, offering him the chance to work in a local shelter where he could help others who were struggling, just as he had. The young man looked surprised but grateful, his eyes filled with relief. As the case was closed, Judge Wilkins felt a sense of pride in the decision he had made. He had not just followed the law, he had considered the person behind the case. That was a step in the right direction, and it felt good. Throughout the rest of the day, Judge Wilkins continued to apply the same mindset. He treated everyone who appeared in his courtroom with respect, taking the time to listen to their stories and understand their circumstances. He didn't let the pressures of the courtroom or his past habits cloud his judgment. Instead, he focused on being fair, treating every person as an individual with a story, not just as a case number. At the end of the day, when he sat back in his office, Judge Wilkins couldn't help but smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He had made progress, and he knew that the work wasn't finished. Every day, he would need to keep working to improve, to ensure that every person who entered his courtroom would be treated fairly. The lessons Alicia had taught him stayed with him, and he knew he had to keep learning. But now, with a renewed sense of respect for those who appeared before him, Judge Wilkins felt ready for whatever challenge came next. As he walked out of the courthouse that evening, the sky was clear, the air crisp. It felt like a new beginning, not just for him, but for everyone who would walk through his courtroom doors in the future. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future, and he was determined to do just that.